Yoga is the cultivation of a subtle internal state. And the truth is that you can't tell whether anyone's doing yoga by looking at them. The real yoga is an internal process. You can be doing yoga while doing physical poses or not.
Hi, I'm Amisha, and this is episode 3 of The Future is Beautiful. My guest today is Christopher Hareesh Wallis. Hareesh is actually one of my teachers. As part of the weave of my work, I teach yoga and meditation through workshops and retreats. Yoga has really become a core pillar in my life. Not only has it connected me deeper to my culture and heritage being Indian, but it has allowed me to show up in everything I do with so much more presence, grace, joy, and an ability to respond rather than react. It has also freed up a lot of pain in my physical body from accidents and shown me how to create a different relationship with my emotions. There is so much yoga out there in the world, and a lot of it focuses on it just as a series of poses. But really, it's something so much deeper. Hareesh is a Tantra and Sanskrit scholar who I first met through my first yoga teacher training when I was given his book, Tantra Illuminated. Hareesh is a really great teacher, and in this interview he shares what it really means to be a yogi, what Tantra really is, and how our yoga and spirituality relates to politics and activism in how we show up in the world. I really hope that you enjoy this interview and it gives you a deeper understanding of yoga. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by Christopher Wallis, who is a Sanskrit and Tantra scholar, a teacher and author, and somebody that we call Hareesh. So can we start with you sharing a bit about where your name comes from and why you have two names?
Yeah, well, it's been almost as long as I can remember. I received the name Hareesh when I was 9, I think. I can remember a little bit before that, but not too much. So I've never really identified myself with either name. I suppose that's one possible effect of having two names, and it certainly has been for me. But it's because my mother wrote to her guru at the time, Swami Muktananda, and requested a spiritual name for herself and her kids, and sent little pictures of us, and he sent back these names, and on the back of the little card, which I can still remember seeing, it's been quite a few years, it said Hareesh on one side and remover of sorrows on the other side. So it's a like many Hindi or Sanskrit names, it's a name of God in the form of the remover of sorrows.
Yeah, beautiful. And you were sharing that it's a name that you grow into, that you feel like you've been growing into.
Yeah, well, I think there's something of a tradition around that. What if an Indian guru gives a name? It's an invitation to grow into that, rather than a naming of what you already are. So that's without specifically intending to at all. My work has moved sort of ever more in that direction of sharing teachings and philosophies and insights and perspectives from the yoga tradition and the tantric tradition that help people get over or get beyond their self-created suffering, which turns out to be really most of our suffering. Right? People think that most of their suffering is because of what happens to them, but it's actually because of the mind's reaction to what happens. So the majority of our suffering is mind created, and so spiritual teachings can certainly help with that. So humans have this extraordinary ability, I find, to suffer regardless of their circumstances, and if even I've had clients who are very, very wealthy people who others would think, oh, they definitely don't have any problems or whatever, but who have a lot of mental or emotional suffering. And I've been amongst very, very poor people in the world, in developing nations, and as long as they aren't in fear of their life and have enough to eat, odds are, I find, they aren't any less happy or aren't any more miserable than some people I know in Beverly Hills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so people contrive to suffer mentally in poor and wealthy and middle circumstances, and that's what spiritual life is about, in part, is the end of that suffering.
I wanted to clear up some of the confusion around actually first what a yogi is, because I feel like that's something that has got so many different connotations in the modern world as to what it means to be a yogi. And for a lot of people it's very aesthetic, like it's a look and a set of poses. And one of the things that really resonated for me with your teachings and the lineage of the teachers that all come from this space is a depth and an understanding of what it really means to be a yogi.
Yeah, so the one thing I'd like to say is that when we're looking to define these terms, I think it's important to look at how they've been used for most of their history. And it's not to discount how these terms are being used now that's different, but that we should perhaps give more weight to how they've been used for most of their history. And so there's many primary sources for understanding what yoga is, both oral and written, but one of my sources is a tantric text called the Neo-Tantra, which says yoga is the cultivation of a subtle internal state. And the truth is that you can't tell whether anyone's doing yoga by looking at them, because there's all kinds of practices that have external components, including the physical poses, and there's all kinds of accoutrements that are ancillary to the practice but not necessary, but the real yoga is an internal process. So you literally can't tell whether anyone's doing yoga by looking at them. And that's an important thing, I think, because you can be doing yoga while doing physical poses or not. And you can be doing yoga while just sitting in a chair or not. And you can be doing yoga ultimately with some practice while walking down the street or not, or in any given situation. The cultivation of this subtle internal state of holistic awareness, we might call it, and unified awareness, where you relax around and soften and melt the internal divisions which most of us experience. That's part of it for sure. And let go of internal reactivity, like self-judgment for your thoughts and feelings, for example. That's one way that we divide ourselves unto ourselves. And so the Neo-Tantra goes on to say that to have self-mastery is to be a yogi. And self-mastery is that ability to respond instead of just react. That ability to be with what is, instead of always trying to push it away or grab onto it or manipulate it. And then finally, the commentary on the Mrigendra Tantra, which is many of these commentaries on tantric texts are written by awakened beings, so they're actually as valuable as the original source, sometimes more valuable. And the commentary on that passage that says to be a yogi is to have self-mastery says that that the state of yoga is one in which you are joined to the manifestation of your own true nature, which is divine, and that is the invariable concomitant of self-mastery. That self-mastery is natural instead of forced when you're connected to the manifestation of your true nature. So that's how they define what a yogi is, because this connected being the key term there, because yoga can mean a state of connection or a state of integration or union, right? But union with what? Union of the conditioned mind to the deeper nature of divine consciousness within. And so when there's that union, that connection, then the mind becomes servant instead of master. Mm-hmm. That's the self-mastery. And the mind becomes a vehicle for consciousness to meet reality and to dance in harmony with reality instead of being at war with it. So that's one way of addressing the question. And people, when they hear this kind of thing, say, oh, well, that's subtle, or that's deep, or whatever. And yeah, the yoga tradition until now didn't have a superficial, nutshell bumper sticker summary. Mm-hmm. And that's the way our minds are working now with memes and stuff.
Yeah. But
the tradition, didn't simplify things to that degree, because so much is lost when you do. And I think we have to resist that tendency to try to sum it up in a headline, because so much is lost in that we, if we have the patience to investigate more deeply, it's incredibly nourishing to our beings. Whereas when we see the meme, we're like, oh yeah, I know that, I know that one, yeah. And it's not the same.
Well, and the reality is that it is a lifelong practice. That self-mastery is not something that one day you're like, bing, and then from that moment, everything. Or maybe it is for some people, but I haven't met any of those people.
No, I don't think so. It's a cultivation, absolutely. And it takes patience, like anything really worth doing. And the faster our culture gets, the more patience is in short supply. But the positive side of that is for those who do want to do the real yoga, as this kind of patience and presence and clarity and self-mastery become rarer, they're therefore more valuable and more impactful and more effective for those who want to cultivate them.
And so for some of our friends listening who are maybe very into yoga, and then they're listening and saying, wait, but I don't know if I'm doing that, where do they start with diving deeper into that subtlety?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, let's think in terms of their physical practice, in terms of their asanas that they're doing on their mat in a yoga studio or at home. And first I would say you're going to incorporate two elements that may already be there and may not. And one is the practice of centeredness. And so by that I mean it's like you're doing whatever pose you're doing, but you're cultivating an awareness of a center point in your being, whether you're experiencing it in the heart or somewhere else, depending on the pose, but that you let awareness have a center which is not the habitual one, like people habitually experience themselves as being somehow in their head, behind their eyes, you know, and so to drop that center point of selfhood down into the body, into the heart, is powerful, and to keep returning attention to that center and almost like surrendering into that center, even as the body is moving through its postures, but simultaneously, and you know this takes practice, but cultivating a holistic awareness. So not just aware of where the stretch is most intense in the body, but the whole body, and also the energy in the room, for lack of a better word, the whole vibe, the whole field of consciousness. So one name I use for this is center and circumference, where circumference actually stands for everything within the circumference, you know, where you can learn how to move your body through the postures or whatever it's doing, and you're cultivating this awareness of the center and of the whole. And the holistic awareness is like, instead of parsing elements and naming them or labeling them, you're just softening your awareness into the whole until it starts to feel like the body is a moving pattern of energy within that field of awareness. And it's got a center, and there's also this expanded field, you know. So, you know, maybe just starting with one of those two and then adding in the other. This is it's a really powerful practice, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to the mind, but you find your way with it. And part of the point of it is that you're dissolving the whole sense of, here's me doing this yoga thing and trying to get somewhere, and I'm better or worse than other people. You know, by focusing your mind on the center and the whole field simultaneously while moving your body, it sort of gives you enough to focus on that it's easier to let all those habitual thoughts go, you know. And then after a while, a kind of blissfulness arises in that's much more beautiful, I think, in a way, and much more powerful than just, oh, it feels good to stretch my body, oh, it feels good to chant Om or whatever. All that's great, but to cultivate this awareness and let all the practices be a kind of pulsation, a moving pattern of energy within that awareness field. So hopefully that's not too subtle of a cue for your listeners.
Well, I just felt it as you were speaking about it, and we went from sitting on a sofa in a living room in London into this other spacious, subtle, it's hard to explain in words, but
it's like a conscious energy field.
Yeah.
Right? And if you felt it, and I think you did, it's the mental picture of what's happening sort of falls away, the mental labeling.
Yeah.
And it's just conscious energy field. And there's a beauty to that. There's a reality to that. Yeah.
And it's a experience that we can experience in whatever we're doing, not just in our practice.
Exactly. We cultivate it in our practice, but then we can extend it to anywhere, anytime. Yeah.
I find the tube a fun place to play with these practices.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, some people have the idea that you can access consciousness, divine consciousness, whatever you're calling it, more in nature or more in a peaceful, quiet place, but that's actually, it's true for some people at the beginning, but then as soon as possible, if you just open to to the possibility of like, oh no, this can be experienced anywhere, because everything is a conscious energy field. There's nothing else anywhere, you know? And so that it's a different quality to the energy field being on the tube, a different flavor of consciousness than being in nature, but it's still this conscious energy field, and it's still ever fascinating and ever intriguing and beautiful when you're suspending your conditioned mind's judgments about it and just being in the pulsation of energy. Is that sort of like what you experience?
Yeah, definitely, because so the tube, just for anyone that's not familiar with London, is what we call the subway, the kind of public transport underground system, and it can be very, if you go in and you're like, especially if you go in at a busy time, you can let your mind create quite a panicked, uncomfortable feeling, because let's be honest, it is quite a panicked, uncomfortable feeling.
Well, lots of people are rushing around.
You're rushing, you're underground. It's like, it's not exactly like an optimal way to spend time. But I do find that that instead of focusing on that, if I look for something subtle and that connection, similar to the connection that I look for in nature when I'm walking through a forest, that I can look for that connection whilst I'm walking through the tube or I'm on the train, because, you know, that's also nature. It's a nature that's been created, but we're part of nature, so we created it as nature.
Yeah. And we create some things that are unpleasant for sure, but there's, you know, there is this opportunity, and in the tube and in many other places, you know, many other situations, and I think the key is, you see, people think they need to attain some kind of quasi-enlightened state to experience urban inner city environment as divine consciousness, but it's not true. You can just, if you drop the idea that, you know, I'm so-and-so who has to get somewhere, and just drop into the conscious energy field and let yourself be borne by the current instead of trying to fight the current or get ahead of it or anything like that. This is why, for a yogi, it really helps to allow a little extra time, if possible, for getting from one place to another, because then you can just relax into, what does it feel like to just go with the current and drop my self-image of I'm so-and-so needs to get somewhere and do something, because it'll all happen anyway without that image, and you can just become this you know, this focal point of consciousness being borne along in a larger current of consciousness. And that's just wonderful. It's delightful, and before you know it, you're having bliss experiences in these crazy crowded places. And then once you have that experience, you're like, why would I sacrifice that to get there a few minutes earlier? Because it's so good, you know? Yeah.
Well, now all my friends and colleagues know why I'm always late.
Yeah.
But it's either that or I've been caught up in the moment and set off too late.
Yeah. And it's, but you know, it's like in the quality of life, you know, not everyone likes it, but it's worth it if you need to be a little late and be in the flow of life instead of always trying to be ahead of it, or, you know.
Or, I mean, you know, I guess ideally we're not late, but we make our lifestyles have more space in them, so there's more spaciousness and there's more time between things.
That's what I usually do, because it really pays off. Yeah.
That having a moment to integrate an experience that we've just had before we have to go into a new one.
Yeah. And that even though everything is the one divine consciousness, we still have needs. And therefore, you know, some yogis who are in the non-dualist sort of practice, they're like, oh, yeah, so, you know, inner city London or New York or wherever, that's divine consciousness too, so I don't need anything else. But the fact is, just like the body needs food and water, it also needs some time in the trees or in the park, or doing something more restful. So that's a big problem I find, actually, in sort of less mature engagement with non-duality, which is very common, is that people don't acknowledge those needs of the body-mind, which are a little less obvious. Just because everything's divine consciousness, you still need, your body still needs food, and in the same way, the body-mind needs moments of repose, whether it's nature or some other context. And without those, I find, you're less and less able to have that experience on the tube or wherever of like, oh, this is divine consciousness too. Whereas when it's part of a rhythm of busyness and stillness, then you're able to see it that way, to experience it that way more.
So there's a few kind of terms that you use that I want us to just break down in case they're new terms for people listening. So the body, the body mind, and the mind, the difference between the three of those?
Oh, there's no difference. It's just just the different terms get used for convenience, but there's no difference at all. It's all one thing. So there's not three things. There's just the body mind. And one way the tradition articulates that is the mind is the subtlest part of the body, but likewise the body is the most tangible expression of mind. That's what a spectrum means. That's what it means that they're a spectrum, right? So there's not, in fact, a body-mind connection, which is too weak of a term. It's a body-mind continuum, or spectrum, whichever term you prefer in this context. They're synonymous. So, a crossfade from the most tangible to the most subtle aspect of this body-mind, But whatever, that which repeatedly arises in the level of mind will inevitably manifest on the level of body, and vice versa, So I think the body-mind has to be viewed as one thing and cared for as one thing. And of course, Western medicine has a nascent awareness of this now, and that awareness is nearly always expressed with the term stress. When doctors say, you need to avoid stress more, you need to be less stressed, it's impacting your health, So it's this extremely simplistic understanding still in Western medicine, but at least an acknowledgement that mental states, mental emotional states play a huge role in physical health, or play some role, and more doctors acknowledging they play a huge role. But stress becomes their catch-all term for issues that are caused or exacerbated by mental emotional states, So, but it's really just more accurate to say we must care for the body-mind as one thing, and in the future, the only way that I think things can reasonably go in terms of the progress of human knowledge is that these currently disparate and distinct fields will merge, because it's actually quite bizarre right now that from the point of view of the truth that we have, psychology and physical Western medicine as like separate fields, very separate fields, and of course, they're also very detailed and complex fields, so no one person can master all the fields related to what is a human being. But these fields have to be in much more dialogue over time if we're going to make progress. And so the interconnected sort of webs have to be mapped more and more thoroughly. And the nichiness of each field has to drop away. It happens in every academic discipline where it's too siloed is the word that some people use, that they're in their own little silo and sort of talking a little bit but not that much to everyone else. So anyway, this is a huge topic.
Yeah.
But body-mind, as write it as all one word, I would say, and I need to train myself to stop saying really anything else, because there is no mind or body separate from that, you know.
Mm-hmm. So it's just that bringing in that awareness of the integration of all of us into the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we understand ourselves.
Yeah, and from both directions, right? Because when we're looking at a physical ailment, the prescription for caring for it has to include addressing the mental, emotional, spiritual aspect, you know. So in the future, I would argue that, you know, no doctor's prescription for a physical ailment will fail to include some kind of meditation or mindfulness in the future, assuming we actually, you know, get our shit together. And from the other point of view, though, that's important too. How many psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on are prescribing somatic work, or prescribing physical yoga, or prescribing body work? Not that many. So the failing is actually on both sides. That both need to think about, well, you know, how can we give a prescription that addresses the whole body-mind? Because each mental or physical ailment has to be addressed by a total body-mind prescription. And to me, it's a little shocking that we're progressing as slowly towards that as we are, because it's so obviously true once you're seeing clearly, you know.
I want to make sure that we come back to Tantra and to the non-dual, but whilst we're here talking about like the body-mind and talking about emotions, I love how you explain about samskaras and how we can move out of a reactive pattern with ourselves and with our relationships and the way that we meet the world. And I think for me, this is the big part of the self-mastery, and definitely an ongoing practice. How can you explain about samskaras and how we can approach this?
Well, that's another huge topic, and I want to, you know, you just mentioned about circling back to non-duality, so I just want to briefly mention first that non-duality or non-dual experience is about having a context in which the work of healing or whatever other work you're doing is more easeful and joyful, and indeed even more possible, you know. So coming back to, you know, what we're calling a non-dual experience, or a oneness experience, or a lack of division experience, this is a way of refreshing ourselves in a certain way. I mean, it ultimately it's the true nature of reality and where we want to abide. But I just want to point out that this work with some samskaras, which we'll define in a moment, is very difficult and not that enjoyable if you're not coming back again and again in your daily practice to the non-dual awareness that actually on the deepest level everything is fine. Then you're perfect exactly as you are. And if you're perfect exactly as you are, and there's nothing that need be done, and you have sort of permission from consciousness, if you want to put it that way, to just be, then what do you actually naturally feel drawn to do? Further healing, growth, and integration is just something that consciousness is naturally drawn to do when it's given permission to do nothing. So that, you see, coming at it from that perspective, I think, is really important. First, establishing you don't need to do anything. You know, you already are the one. There's only the one. The universe manifests as you. It hasn't made a mistake. You're not wrong or broken. Even sometimes you feel broken. but you're not actually broken, you know? And yet, we know there can be more, we can experience the joy of being what we are more than we currently do. We can experience wholeness more than we currently do. Even though we are whole, that doesn't mean we're experiencing it all the time, you know? So then we're like, oh yeah, I want to do this healing, and I want to do this integration, and I want to experience the fullness of my true nature more and more. That's just natural. Do you see what I mean? But we have to keep coming back to just resting in the awareness that everything's okay, and I'm well, you don't want to say I'm perfect, because then the ego co-opts that thought and uses it for bypassing. But perfection is, instead of I'm perfect, just perfection is, you know, and resting in that awareness, and then it gives you more energy, more inspiration to then do the work. Calling work, you know, we don't have to call it work, but the healing, the integration of just, you know, all these samskaras, which we could just call the previously rejected parts of ourselves, or the unresolved experiences hanging out in our system. You know, sometimes they're rejected aspects of ourselves. Sometimes they're things we're clinging to, thinking they'll give us fulfillment. You know, so whether we're clinging to them or rejecting them, it's these unintegrated pieces of ourselves that the process of healing is really a process of dissolving or digesting these unintegrated pieces of ourselves into the larger whole, until there are no more pieces. I mean, that's just a quick way to sum it up, is that we experience ourselves as having many parts, and having many parts means you're going to feel torn a lot, because one part of you wants this, one part of you wants that. And that's not a fulfilling way to be. It's the default human state. And the default human state is non-fulfillment. So for more and more of these parts to become integrated is to experience being torn or divided less and less often. And I can attest to that, and many other people can attest to that being very much what happens in this practice, assuming the practice is at least partially oriented towards this. You know, because some people just want to, without realizing it often, they just want to transcend out of their body-mind and experience transcendent consciousness, and not do the more difficult work of integrating the unintegrated parts. So those people can have transcendent experiences and experience themselves as infinite consciousness or the divine or whatever, but when it comes to their human relationships, we don't see much change, because that integration work is another step beyond experiencing your transcendent nature, that you have to, most people have to choose that. It doesn't happen automatically, you know.
Yeah, and you know, before I made that choice, I would find it so hard to make any decision about what to eat or where to go, or what, you know, this job or that or this or this dress or whatever it was, and it like so much turmoil over things that are so, you know, that they're all fine. Like, it doesn't even, I feel now it doesn't really matter which one I go, but I kind of have naturally found a place where I just naturally know where I'm inclined to go, and that the drama that was quite time consuming of making a choice has disappeared. I'm very grateful for that, to these practices.
Yeah, that's really important, because it's also about letting go of trying to make things go the best possible way each time. You know, and because if you know, of course you use your discernment and cultivate clarity of view, so that you can navigate in a way that to some extent corresponds to what people call success in life, right? But at the same time, the sort of, it becomes an anxious compulsion when we try to make things go the best possible way each time, you know, like whether it's choosing, I've got to make sure I choose the dress that I'm gonna still like a year from now, you know, or whatever, you know, or like we experienced yesterday, like, but we want to end up somewhere that we really like, but the food and the drink and the thing, but you can't always have it. Also, at some point, you're just, okay, this is what's happening, and here we are, and you know, there are other infinite possibilities which might, will actualize at other moments.
Yeah.
You know, and which you'll enjoy different facets of those, and now we're enjoying these facets of this one, you know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's about letting go that there is a best choice.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, because that's a mental image. It's like trying to steer things towards a mental image of what would be best when we don't know.
And we don't really, there is no real definition for what best is.
Right. Well, we want to be pleased is the thing. As human body minds, we want to be pleased. You know, we want to be eating the food that's pleasing us, and we want to be seeing the things that are pleasing us. And letting go of that too. You know, of course there's no, you know, of course better and worse is a mental construct, but what's not a mental construct is the body-mind being in a state of being pleased or not pleased. And if we get attached to the body-mind being pleased all the time, that itself becomes a huge source of suffering, you know.
Because true bliss, true ananda also incorporates the bliss of the suffering, or of all of the flavors of experience.
I would call it the bliss of aliveness.
Yeah.
And it's because nobody's ever happy about being in pain, but there's a bliss of aliveness that can include pain.
Yeah.
That as part of the whole spectrum, where at last you're kind of just not only accepting but loving the whole spectrum of aliveness. And it's not, you know, it's not that you enjoy pain, but you love the aliveness of the full spectrum of humanity, and that has to include pain, you know. And there is a kind of feeling like I would describe it as I feel lucky to be alive, to experience sad moments. I feel lucky to be, you know. You don't have to have that thought specifically, but it's the feeling of, you know, how glorious it is to be alive, to experience heartbreak and everything else, and because it's going to be the full spectrum unless you're numbing yourself out, which of course a lot of people do. It's going to be the full spectrum, and you can't manipulate it to just be the parts that feel good. So then ultimately the only solution is to fall in love with what it means to be a human being in a full spectrum way. And that takes maturity, and that takes spiritual practice, you know, that helps us mature.
And then we can experience the beauty of that aliveness as we're sat there crying, can experience the beauty of that experience.
Yeah.
Or as, you know, as things are not working out as we imagined or as we had hoped, or anger, all of these different things that we can just understand the beauty that is.
Yeah, and that's hard to imagine from a kind of conditioned mind perspective, but when we don't attach to or make a story out of our emotions, when we don't make a self out of our emotions too, like oh, I'm so awful, I got angry at that person, I'm such a bad person, or, oh, I'm such a great person, or that's making a self out of our emotions. It's just a story, right? When we don't do any of that, then the emotional energy can flow through. And the reason I'm saying this is because if emotional energy gets stuck, it's hard to view it as intrinsically beautiful. Whereas when it's flowing, even if it's a so-called negative emotion, you can experience it as intrinsically beautiful when it's flowing. And so to allow it to flow through instead of get stuck, we need to learn how to not buy into our stories about our emotions.
Yeah.
And that's when the anger, grief, frustration even can be a thing of beauty, but usually not when it gets stuck due to telling a story about it, such as a story of blaming someone else or blaming yourself.
Yeah.
And then believing the story, emotion gets stuck, and then it's just icky. And ultimately, if you're an advanced practitioner, you can learn to enjoy ickiness too. But the natural thing is just release the story, let it move through, and the natural balance restores itself.
And this is something that, as a community, I would just love for us to be able to give each other more space for our emotions. And something that I love about the yoga community that I'm part of, that you can just be crying like all the way through a practice, and someone might put a tissue near you or give you a smile, but they know that you're just crying, and there's no need to stop it, to comfort it as such, unless you want, obviously, if you want a hug. But it's like, I find so much outside of that there's a rush to kind of stop the emotions and get back to like a normal, whatever a normal state means, as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And then it all gets stuck, and it's there in the body mind doing other things.
Yeah. Yeah, people have a fear of suffering or of pain. Of pain. They don't want to have to witness it in others. In normal social contexts, they will, if you talk about having a really hard time, people immediately go into, oh, well, here's the silver lining, or here's how to fix it, or here's why you shouldn't feel so bad. And that's the whole key to this samskara teaching, is that, if you buy the story, as we inevitably do as kids, you shouldn't feel so bad. That means this part of me that's feeling bad is not okay in some way. And that's what I'm calling an exiled or rejected part of ourselves, And so this is a very hard thing, I think, for human beings to learn, but we're slowly learning it, which is that the true empathy means, at first, and maybe for the whole time, you're just being with. You're just being with it and holding the person, whether it doesn't need to be, whether it's physical, depending on how well you know them, or just energetic, a feeling of holding them, holding space for them, as that emotion moves through, and not feeling that this is wrong or needs to be fixed. And then after that, if it feels right, we can look at, what are some other perspectives on this, which is even then not about fixing it, but just about let's see if we can get more clarity of view on this situation that's has some challenge for you or some grief for you. Let's explore it. And that's different from that organic exploration, which people can do with and for each other. It doesn't need to be this industry of therapy and coaching, and it's all fine. But we can more and more do it for each other until that becomes the default human mode of like, let's explore this together in an open-ended organic exploration, as opposed to let me jump to the first silver lining I can think of and use it to push down the pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. So this is a bit of a jump from from pain to something that happens a lot when people ask me, okay, well, what kind of meditation do you do, and where have you trained or whatever, and then one starts to talk about Tantra, and then of course a whole conversation, smirky smiles, and a whole kind of conversation about sex emerges, and I know this is something that you have to address a lot, of the history and the roots of Tantra and what it actually is, and then Neo-Tantra and what that's become.
Yeah. People have told me that my attempt and other scholars' attempt to sort of reclaim the word Tantra from the popular culture and use it in its original sense is fruitless. That it's already too late. I'm not sure that's true, though. This one of these books, there's these series of books, 1001 so-and-so, like this book was 1001 ideas that change the way we think or whatever. So it's 1001 cultural and scientific ideas, and it's just a book in this series. But anyway, that I was excited to see they had an entry for tantric sex, and that it was invented in 1915. And that's actually, somebody did some actual research there, because, they had the date slightly wrong. The first teachings on what we now call tantric sex is, a little over 100 years old, and it originates in the West. And due to a kind of misunderstanding or even hearsay about some classical Indian tantric teachings, and there's a whole story behind this, but people can look up if they want this fellow, Pierre Bernard, who's the first Neo-Tantra teacher, starting in around 1900 in San Francisco. San Francisco was like that even then.
1900.
Yeah. It's always been a wonderfully weird place. So Pierre Bernard would dress up in robes with, occult symbols on them, and he would initiate people and teach them these, tantric sexual practices that he almost entirely invented. But he had studied, and the Neo-Tantra has been like this ever since. He had studied some real Indian philosophy, and he would mix that in, and so he was a charismatic charlatan, who people can actually receive teachings that they find beneficial from charismatic charlatans, and that's happening now, and it was happening then. So he founded the Tantric Order of America, which was, didn't last very long because it was, he suffered some scandals, as you can imagine. And he has a fascinating life documented in a relatively recent book. But anyway, so he's the creator. As far as we know, we haven't found any earlier source for these Neo-Tantra or Tantric sex teachings, which have no direct connection to the original tradition. Meaning to say, Pierre Bernard, the first person to teach Tantric sex, did not have initiation into a Tantric lineage, and there's never been a direct lineage connection between the original tradition and Neo-Tantra. So scholars, rightly regard it as just, a separate cultural phenomenon. Though everything gets more confused, though, when Neo-Tantric teachers go and sort of retrieve more material from classical Tantra and pull it over into Neo-Tantra, thus making it look as if Neo-Tantra has more of a connection than it really does to classical Tantra. So as a linguist, I would actually just regard this use of the word tantra as a homonym or an English word, not a Sanskrit word, if you will. The English word tantra. I'm perfectly content for the English word tantra to mean sacred sexuality, and the Sanskrit word, if it is sacred, I don't even know. It's like that depends on how people are doing it, I think. But they call it sacred sexuality.
It depends on the teachers.
I think it does, yeah. It's not...
the intention. And I think some of it is really sacred.
Sure. But to distinguish the English word tantra as sacred sexuality teachings, and then the Sanskrit word tantra as referring to this very complex and nuanced system of practices which are primarily to do with inner yoga, and which was never a partner practice. See, that's the most shocking part for people, and that we can quickly, in a few words, show that these are two different things, because classical tantra is not a partner practice. Classical tantra has nothing to do with enhancing pleasure or even enhancing intimacy between two people. It has nothing to do with peak experiences per se. It has to do with spiritual realization, and it's an individual practice, and it's an inner practice. So like with yoga, even more so with tantra, you can't tell if somebody's doing tantra by looking at them. It's a whole inner practice. Whereas Neo-Tantra is a partner practice. It's aimed at enhancing pleasure and bliss. Some people also say they're using it for spiritual attainment of some kind, but it's definitely a partner practice, or a kind of something you're doing with another human. So great. There's nothing wrong with any of it. It's just two different things. And I even have a couple of students who are learning to be teachers of both, and they now understand very well that they're two different things. But that doesn't make them inherently incompatible. And so, a couple of my students are teachers of classical tantra and Neo-Tantra, and that's fine. Why not? But it's they're largely have two different goals. Yeah, which makes them different things.
And so now, it's funny because I guess now I'm a bit more light-hearted about it. But a bit earlier, when I was a bit more serious yogi, I would say, well, it's from Kashmir Shaivism, because I would hate to use the word tantra because of then having people think something else. And now, of course, I'm like, okay, it's fine, just let them think whatever they want. And I know what I'm teaching and what I'm offering and what I'm practicing. But are you using the word tantra to explain mostly? Obviously.
Now I use tantric yoga a lot more, because tantra itself is easier to misinterpret than if I say tantric yoga.
Yeah.
And I write it with a K because that's closer to the Sanskrit spelling. And so they still might make assumptions that don't apply, but with that term there's a little bit more of maybe I don't know what that is, tantric yoga. So yeah. But it really depends what perspective you're coming at it from, because if you're coming at it from a postmodern cultural studies perspective, or a concern with cultural appropriation, we can hardly deny that the use of the word tantra and tantric in this sacred sexuality scene is cultural appropriation. It certainly is. The question is, how harmful or benign is it? That's for cultural studies people to hash out, So from that perspective, we can say, well, maybe it's problematic. And for people whose who have a South Asian heritage and have come to realize that Tantra includes some of the most sophisticated and beautiful philosophies ever articulated, they might feel that this usage of the term in Neo-Tantra circles is doing a disservice to their tradition or the Indian tradition by distorting people's understanding. I can totally get that whole argument, but I just don't want to be outraged all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be in that vibe. So even though I sympathize with that argument, my personality is much more inclined to just say, people are going to do what they're going to do, and there's no point in fighting with the way several million people want to define Tantra.
Yeah, and I mean, I know I've asked a lot about definitions of terms in this interview. It wasn't necessarily planned that way, but I guess it's because there's so much of because with all of the words that exist, it's so easy to do that. Oh, I know what that is, and then like reject or accept it. And I feel like part of just opening up this conversation here about these words is just an invitation to explore things on a deeper level and to be curious about what they really are.
Yeah, and at risk of sounding like a plug, that's why I wrote my first book, Tantra Illuminated.
I was going to plug it for you.
And it's a deep dive for those who have only a casual interest, but so many countless people have written me saying something very similar, which is, I've learned bits of yoga philosophy, I've learned bits of non-dual philosophy, I've learned these practices from here and there, and your book, they write, brought everything together in a cohesive whole for the first time for me, and I understood how, there's this comprehensive tradition from 1,000 and more years ago that has sort of trickled down to the present and into the modern yoga world in sort of drips and drabs, as it were, or bits and bobs, whatever the term would be, and to be able to see how everything fits together is very, very exciting for people. So a few people do read the book who are just like, what's Tantra? I have no idea. I'll read this book. But most of the people who are reading it are people who they want to understand the deeper context for things they've already learned, and it's satisfying for people to have that, things are clicking into place in a way, and it's like to see how, some people have heard Kashmir Shaivism, and how is that a part of it, or how and so on and so forth. How is Hatha Yoga a part of it? And that's I think that's it's been a valuable contribution. Somebody requested me to write this book, and then it by some miracle it happened, and it's now a force of its own. It's just out there, just like spreading by word of mouth still.
An incredible resource.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to talk about one more thing before we have to close, which is that for me, in my own journey, I worked in politics and sustainability and was kind of out there trying to change the world in quite a reactive, shall we say, way. And then I realized that I had to pay more attention to my inner world, and that took me on into another space. And of course it came clear to me that it was time to bring the things together, unite everything, and to move out of this siloed way of living. And one of the things that I enjoy about your teachings, and also the things that you write and share, is this awareness of how we can use these practices to understand ourselves more, but also to contribute more. Can you share a little bit about that, and the times that we're living in and the political times that we're in,
Yeah. Well, some people, there's a yoga intellectual critical cultural studies circle in North America centered on a friend of mine, Matthew Remski, and some people in that circle argue there's nothing in yoga per se that encourages or connects to social activism or any particular values in the political landscape or whatever. And that's actually true for some forms of yoga. For Patanjali's yoga, for example, there's nothing in there, apart from a few lines about, don't hurt other people. There's nothing really in there that connects to our sense of social responsibility and social activism. But that's not true for in the same way in tantric yoga, which is advocates an engagement with life, and there's also a very strong egalitarian ethos in non-dual tantric yoga. And so I think for people interested in yoga and in Eastern philosophy and spirituality, tantric yoga is really the place to go to discover teachings that can work in the context of an engagement, of a social activism and so on. And this radical egalitarianism is part of that. So, unlike Patanjali's yoga, I think Tantra absolutely has a teaching of we have diverse body minds, one consciousness with diverse body minds, and that diversity doesn't justify any hierarchy. And hierarchy is a huge part of Indian society. Traditionally, but Tantra sought to criticize that and say caste and hierarchy is a social cultural construct. They said that 1,000 years ago. It's a very postmodern sort of thought to us, but that's what they said, and that there's the one consciousness manifests diversity, and that doesn't imply better or worse. That doesn't imply hierarchy, and if you think it does, that's your cultural conditioning, and so there is an ethos there that tells us about a value that has political, ramifications today, because it's a value of that would have us position ourselves against, if you want to think of it that way, against racism, and against discrimination against, transgender people and so on and so forth, So those I think those values are very much there, and the point is, though, not to get into an ideology from a spiritual point of view. It's not to get into and fight for a specific ideology, because if it's an ideology, you're always going to be violent in your opposition to other people. Even if your ideology is egalitarianism, then you can be violent, like the Antifa are, in your opposition to people who are behaving in a racist manner, right? So I think the key is not ideology, but going deeper and deeper into this non-dual experience of oneness with all life, and then allowing natural expression of that to arise in the various spheres of life and to be engaged, but in this natural way of instead of fighting for a belief system, we should all be like this. It's just doing what comes naturally in having experienced and seen the truth of unity and that and one and diversity within oneness.
And it comes back to the aliveness, and so the more alive we are, then we'll be moved to support something or stand up for something.
We'll have more energy to do it.
Share awareness about something.
Absolutely, yeah. the aliveness and the perception, the clarity of view. Also, clarity of view is, to see, to look at another human being and see that whatever costume consciousness is wearing and whatever color that costume is, it's the one consciousness looking back at you through those eyes, and to let that insight and experience penetrate into your heart is to let your mind be changed if you don't yet fully embrace radical egalitarianism, and people can be changed by it, and so it has to be rooted in experience if it's not going to be just another ideology. Yeah.
Thank you. There's so much more we could talk about.
We could talk again too.
Days and hours. Yeah, definitely, definitely. We'll find another time. I just want to share with everyone that's listening that we'll post links to where you can find out more about Hareesh's work, and I highly, highly recommend coming to Hareesh's courses and workshops, spending time with you, and your online courses, which I have yet to do, but some of my very close friends have done the 40-day awareness challenge, and I can see how it has impacted them in their lives, and so definitely
thank you.
One that I would like to do next year, and that I recommend for our listeners to check out if they've been moved by this conversation. And your website is tantricstudies.org with a K.
Yeah.
Tantric with a K.
Exactly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.